Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this week's episode of Horns, we hear a talk given in November by University of Texas Professor Jeremi Suri about his forthcoming book, Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. Suri outlines how the events of January 6th, and indeed events that have preceded and followed it in terms of the contentious, difficult, and sometimes violent political environment in which Americans find themselves today, can trace its roots to the American Civil War. Although Suri doesn't use this term explicitly, he describes the period we are living in as almost a second Reconstruction, taking up in many ways the themes that were addressed, abandoned, and handled in various unofficial, sometimes violent, sometimes discriminatory ways in the aftermath of the Civil War. Indeed, if slavery is America's original sin, the resolution of the Civil War is the founding error in our modern republic that leads to so many challenges in resolving questions of equity, involvement, politics, as well as personal liberties. This is an important and fascinating discussion to anyone of any political stripe who loves America and wishes for it to be a society that is more free, more just, and more able to fulfill its promises. Let's listen in.
I wrote this book that I'm going to talk about today as an intellectual and to some extent a political journey. I've been a historian for about 20 years and was in graduate school for years before that. So since I was 2 years old, I've been doing this. The last 6 years or so shook me in ways I never thought I'd be shaken. I'm a historically minded person who believes that the changes we see in front of us are usually very minor in the grand scheme of things, that we focus on what's in front of us, but in reality there are long trends of history, long tectonic forces that really move people. And anyone who studied with Paul Kennedy, this is at the core of Paul Kennedy's understanding of geopolitics and power, that empires rise and fall, and actually there's very little that leaders can do. They can make it a little less bad, or they can make it a little worse. And I wrote a whole book on Henry Kissinger, and this is at the center of Henry Kissinger's thinking as well. But the last 6 or 7 years have shaken me because I've seen changes in our institutions, threats to our institutions, an undermining of our institutions that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. I'm curious, how many people in this room have been shaken the last few years? So this is maybe the 15th or 16th audience I've spoken to, by far the best, in the most beautiful room. And pretty much everyone in every audience has raised their hand when I've asked them that, which is really interesting. And the audiences have crossed politically a bit, though I think they've probably been a little center left, but they have crossed to the right a bit too. The threat to our institutions is something that surprised me at the scale that it's occurred. Most of my other books, most of my other scholarship focused on American policymaking. I'm a political diplomatic historian, and I believe that political diplomatic history is the best insight for understanding our world today. Of course, I believe that. It's what I do. But most of my scholarship really presumed that there were certain bedrock parts of our democracy that weren't going to change. Peaceful transitions of power. Elections where the loser lost and left. A system where people stood up for democracy against those who threatened it. That there were lines you could not cross. I remember when I was early in my career as a professor, I was in Madison, Wisconsin then, I remember when Trent Lott, as the Republican leader in the Senate, was outed for some really dumb comments and forced to resign. Forced to resign. There was a line. There was a line you couldn't cross in the Republican Party if you said certain racial things. And what he said, actually, compared to what we see today every day, was actually pretty minor. I'm not going to repeat it, but you can look it up. And it wasn't unusual. It actually seemed that that's the way our politics should work. It wasn't political correctness. It was actually that there are lines that you don't cross, regardless of your politics. That democracy was our civil religion. Democracy was our unquestioned faith. I believe that myself. In fact, I had to believe that. I still believe that. I can't let go of that because of who I am. I'm the child of immigrants. My father came as an immigrant fleeing famine in India in 1965. He got to come to this country because Lyndon Johnson signed the Immigration Act of 1965 that for the first time allowed Indians to come to this country. When he came to New York City in 1965, no one knew what Indian food was. People asked him at his university if Indians ate eggs. People were so ignorant of that part of the world, but yet our country welcomed him. And my father's never been wealthy. He has a retirement plan. It's called me. But he's been able to live the kind of life that would be unthinkable if he had been stuck in India in 1965 during the conditions that India was dealing with at that time. My mother is the child of Russian Jewish immigrants who came to the United States fleeing pogroms. Members of my family on both sides were killed by people in Russia and people in India. Two of my grandmother's closest brothers were killed during the partition in India, just as an example. And the fact that my family could come to this country, and the fact that I could then have a career where I do things that no one in my family can understand and actually get paid for it is an extraordinary thing. I shouldn't be here. How could I not love this country? I will stand second to no one in my love of the United States. But the last 6 to 7 years have shaken my faith in this country. And this book is not an effort to solve that problem. It's too big a problem for any one person to solve. It's to understand that. What do we really do as historians? We diagnose illnesses and diseases in our society. We understand, and we answer phones when they ring during our lectures. What we do as historians is we don't tell policymakers what to do day to day. We never know as much as they know on a day-to-day basis. We can't. But what we do have is the perspective that allows us to understand why we're in the conditions we're in today. And if you don't diagnose a problem, you have no chance to solve it. If you don't diagnose a problem, you are solving something else. You are doing something else. 90% of the policies that are pursued in our country at the state, federal, or any level are not actually solutions to the problems that they claim to be solutions for. Good policymaking starts by understanding the problem. So this book is an effort. It's my intellectual journey, actually acknowledging my own prior ignorance, going into spaces I hadn't done research on before. And it's so wonderful we get to do this, to better understand why over the last 6 to 7 years our democracy has been so shaken. And what I came to find doing the research, reading lots of old materials, reading old newspapers, trying to understand the development of American political discourse, trying to understand the development of our institutions, what I found was that at the end of the Civil War, there are a number of cancers that develop in our institutions. Our institutions, in some ways, are reformed and made better. The end of slavery being Exhibit A. And few societies, we are late to end slavery, but few societies end slavery as quickly as we do when we do. So this is not to say that the institutions built after the Civil War are all bad. In fact, it's a very mixed bag. But it is to say that the democratic institutions made during what is the Second American Revolution, Civil War, have cancers built into them. And the tumors from these cancers have been lodged in these institutions for a long time. They're not mistakes, they're not accidents. In many cases, they're intentionally placed there. In other cases, they reflect the circumstances of that moment. And those tumors have been there for decade upon decade. Oftentimes, the body can still go on in a healthy way with these tumors within it. At other moments, because of environmental conditions and because of bad behavior, those tumors metastasize and they debilitate the larger body. And that's where we are today. These are old tumors that have metastasized, and these are old tumors which in their metastasizing have now threatened the larger organism called our democracy. My book is an effort to understand those pathologies. It's to do what any good doctor would do. Now my kids always remind me I'm the wrong kind of doctor. We were on a plane once where they asked for a doctor, and immediately my son looked at me and said, "Not you, Dad." It's like, thank you for the respect, son. But pretending I'm a doctor, it is the effort to understand the pathologies in our society, pathologies that go back to this Second American Revolution. And there are three I'm going to talk about today. One has to do with war, one has to do with leadership, and one has to do with democracy itself. We're going to talk about the nature of perpetual war within our society, failed leadership, something Will and I have both written a lot about, and I've learned so much from Will's work and his new book on Reagan that I encourage everyone to read after they read my book. Notice we've spaced them out. and the distortions of our democracy. In each of these cases, it's not that the events of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s determined where we are today, but it's that they deeply conditioned where we are today. And here's my larger argument, that if we go back to that moment, as I have in my book, I start with January 6th, but then I go back to that moment. If we go back to that moment, we can better understand what we're dealing with today, and we can come up with better ideas about what to do about it. The gift of the last 6 to 7 years has been the unmasking of the disease that has been deep within for a long time. And the only way you cure a disease is by recognizing it. And so we can now see what I certainly, even as a historian, didn't see 6, 7 years ago. And seeing it, we can now do something about it. And I'm happy to say that at least among my undergraduates, some of whom are in the audience here, and among my graduate students, some of whom are in the audience, I see a desire to do just that. I think it's a wrong reading of our society to say that we are politicized and divided among young people. It's not true. Young people are more problem solvers than I've ever seen. They have other issues. They're on their phones too much, etc. But we have the opportunity today to have a clearer diagnosis than we could have had 6 years ago. And that diagnosis can motivate us to actually make change in ways we couldn't. And I even believe that change can be bipartisan or post-partisan or whatever prefix you want to put on partisan to get us there. I actually have a piece that'll be coming out next week on that particular issue. So you can read about that next week. So let me start with war. And one of the most important moments in my book is at Appomattox in April of 1865. This is a very famous moment, of course, where Robert E. Lee, the commander of Confederate forces, sits down with Ulysses Grant, the commander of Union forces. This moment will never happen between Putin and Zelensky, but we wish it would. These two men sit down, and Lee agrees to send his soldiers home from the battlefield. That's the agreement. Our soldiers will leave the battlefield, and I, General Lee, will not command my soldiers to the battlefield again. That's the heroic part of the story, but there's a lot more to it. And I encourage everyone in this room, after they read my book and Will's book, to read Ulysses Grant's memoirs. How many people have read Ulysses Grant's memoirs? Great, we have a very learned audience. I knew Paul had read. Paul and I are both friends and fans of Ulysses Grant. Grant's memoir is the best memoir written by any politician in U.S. history. If you read one memoir by one American politician, read Grant's. He, by the way, wrote it at the end of his life, encouraged by Mark Twain to write it as he was dying, because he was a great general, as I'll say later, a poor president, and terrible at managing his money. And he had to do something to leave money for his family. So it's a very touching story. He wrote the memoir to leave money for his wife and kids. Grant reveals in the memoir, he describes in the memoir this meeting, and once you get beyond the heroic discussion, he says something very interesting. He says, I asked General Lee to help me reconcile the two parts of our country. And General Lee said to me that the South is a very big country, and you might have to march over it 3 or 4 times before this war is really done. 3 or 4 times you might have to march over the South. Now note that Lee is not advocating that. Lee is sending a message. And in fact, for the record, Lee will go home. Lee will criticize some of the most extreme reverence for the Confederacy, but he will never renounce the cause, nor will he renounce those who claimed to continue to defend the cause thereafter. This is very important, right? Lee is often depicted as actually being part of the solution. He's not. He's a continued part of the problem. He's not as bad as many others. He doesn't go out and try to kill people any further, but he's not part of the solution. We should not expect the losers in most wars to do that. What happens in Germany, and to some extent in Japan after World War II, is the exception. Americans have come to believe that that's the model of what happens at the end of a war, right? The unconditional surrender of the Nazi regime and the almost complete capitulation of the Nazi regime and the acceptance of that defeat is almost unprecedented. Almost unprecedented, and it is not at all what happens in the United States. The losers don't give up, just as they didn't give up in Afghanistan or Iraq, right? Saddam Hussein's regime lost. We beat them, but then they kept fighting in other ways. They continued to resist. Wars don't end when the bigger army defeats the smaller army. The war just moves into a new sphere, a new place then. I spend a lot of time in the book on a large group of Confederates who literally did not surrender. And this is left out of most of our history books. I'll reveal that our good friend and advisor, David Kennedy, told me at dinner recently, he's like, oh my gosh, I've got to now rewrite a part of my textbook because of your book. And I was like, yes, that's great. Mission accomplished. More than 50,000 Confederates decide they're not going to surrender. And a larger number than that even go to Brazil. That 50,000 go to Mexico. They leave through Texas. They march through Austin, through San Antonio, and they march into Texas, and march into Mexico, following a series of commanders who have decided that they will take their armies and their slaves with them. And I profile these figures in the book. They're fascinating figures, and they're fascinating to research on because they still have a cottage industry of people who revere them. So in fact, doing research on these figures is one of the easiest part of the book because there are literally hundreds of books about them, collections of their diaries and papers, just not from academic presses, but from various cottage industry presses. And that has been consistent over the last 150 years. That tells you something unto itself. Let me give you some of their names. General Joseph Shelby. Shelby was considered one of the best Confederate fighters in this part of the country. He was from Missouri. He defeated repeated Union campaigns in this area. And after he learns of Lee's surrender, Shelby offers his soldiers the chance to go home or come with him, he says, and continue the glorious fight. And almost all his officers, at least, go with him. He marches into Mexico, treated as a hero when he comes through Austin, when he goes through San Antonio. And in Mexico, he joins Maximilian I's army. Maximilian is the cousin of Louis Napoleon, who is the nephew of the Napoleon Bonaparte. Louis Napoleon has been elected president in 1848, made himself emperor in 1851 of France, and he has committed himself to regaining the glory of his uncle. And how is he going to do that? He explicitly states he wants the Louisiana territories back. So, because of the debt-ridden government in Mexico, he does what was frequent in this case. He sends military forces to collect the debt. The Mexican government can't claim the debt, can't cover the debt. So he sends Maximilian I in as his new installed emperor in Mexico. Maximilian brings in these Confederate forces. Shelby joins Maximilian's army. Maximilian settles Shelby and others in a new town called Carlotta that he creates with plantation space for them to bring their slaves. By the way, Shelby joining a foreign military, that is the definition of treason, right? No disagreement on that. John Bankhead Magruder, another general, and anyone with that name is going to be fascinating, right? John Bankhead Magruder was considered, this is what was said of him in the newspapers at the time, one of the most charismatic, swashbuckling Confederate commanders. This man also takes his forces into Mexico and also joins Maximilian's army. Ambassador Matthew Fontaine Maury, who those of you in the field of geography or nautical studies would know, he was one of the pioneering scholars of nautical geography in the 19th century. He was also the Confederate ambassador to Great Britain during the war. He doesn't come back to the United States. He goes to Mexico and becomes the chief promoter for settlement by Confederates in Mexico. He's actually the highest paid official in Maximilian's government. And then finally, the fourth one I'll just mention now, the one everyone should know in this room, but many of you probably don't, General Alexander Watkins Terrell. How many people have heard of Alexander Watkins Terrell? That's amazing. That's great that you have. I was giving this talk the other day at Book People, and our former colleague Chris King said, oh, that was my great uncle. Like, oh my gosh. He's like, there's a reason I haven't told anyone. Alexander Watkins Terrell was a judge in Houston, joined the Confederate Army. He was a terrible fighter, but because he was a judge in Houston, he was made a general. He went to Mexico as well, and my friend Steve Slick will find this interesting, as will Paul Pope. He became the head of Maximilian's intelligence, spied on Grant. Grant wanted to court-martial him. There are letters from Grant to President Johnson and to the Congress, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, where he wants to find Terrell and court-martial him. The man spied on the U.S. Army. These individuals, Shelby, Magruder, Maury, Terrell, they joined the Mexican army to protect the Confederate aims, to protect slavery, to protect their control when Maximilian was defeated. as you all know, happened. There's the famous Edward Manet painting of Maximilian being shot by Benito Juarez's forces, the Republican forces that had actually been supported by Lincoln before Lincoln's death. When Maximilian is defeated and the French forces withdraw from Mexico, these four men and most of the 50,000 who were in Mexico, they come back to the United States and they declare themselves heroes. Here's why you should know Alexander Watkins Terrell. There's a county named after him here in Texas. His papers are at the Briscoe Center, which was convenient for me. Terrell wrote the legislation to create the University of Texas. When he came back to Texas, he was elected to the Senate as a Democratic figure, became the leader in the Democratic Senate, wrote the legislation to create the University of Texas. He also wrote the voting laws for Texas. He wrote the voting laws for Texas. And there he's actually up there. I didn't even know that. Those who serve best both God and country are those who wisely instruct youth. Well, he clearly served God and country, right, by joining the Mexican army. He wrote the election laws in Texas. They were known as the Terrell election laws. He created the white primary. How many people have heard of the white primary? Good, a few have. I've talked to large groups of lawyers and well-educated people in Texas who had their mandatory Texas education and didn't know about the white primary. The white primary, which existed from the 1880s until 1944, until the Smith versus Allwright decision of the Supreme Court written by Robert Jackson in 1944. For those 70 years, it was illegal for someone non-white to vote in the Democratic primary in Texas. And the argument was that the primary was a private entity. It was not an election. And so even if you could vote in the election, you could not vote in the primary to choose the candidates. So just think about this for a second. Those who resist the end of the war, those who join a foreign army, commit treason, become the people who write the rules for the operations of our democracy in Texas. And it's not unique to Texas at all. General Shelby came back, was appointed marshal for the Missouri section of the country. He is responsible for sending federal forces in to break Union strikes time and again in the 1880s and 90s. He is the infamous federal figure responsible for quite literally putting down Union activism throughout the country at this time. Magruder becomes a very prominent lecturer in New York as well as in Houston and becomes one of the foremost advocates of what will soon be called the Jim Crow laws in the South. These individuals who continued to resist, they came back into power. Our institutions allowed them to, largely because they were pardoned. The 14th Amendment would have made it impossible for them to serve in elected office, but because of the presidential pardons they received from Andrew Johnson, they were all able to come back in. And so you have this situation where by the 1870s and 80s, you have the very people who lost the war without recanting why they fought, now running key institutions of democratic accountability within the United States. There's resistance at many other levels, and this is relevant for where we are today. I just finished writing a piece that'll be out in a couple of days on the attack on Paul Pelosi that echoes this. Organized violence and bullying becomes the lingua franca of politics in much of our country. After the Civil War, it's not only that people go home with their weapons, it's that local organization of violence becomes standardized in a way it was not before the Civil War. Let me put this as clearly as I can. By 1870 and 80, there's more paramilitary vigilante violence, not just in the South, also in the North, than there was before the Civil War. The war literally comes home. The Ku Klux Klan, the Red Shirts, and many others. And I talk in my book about organized riots that occur in Memphis, Tennessee, Colfax, Louisiana, and the beginnings of a long history of lynching in this country that is not only a Southern story. There are more people lynched in Indiana than in many Southern states. What is happening in all these cases is groups of local community leaders, including police officers, are forming their own vigilante posses to enforce the law, and there's very little federal limitation and very little federal punishment for this that occurs. People often say that January 6th, 2021 was the first attempted coup in our society. It certainly was an attempted coup, but it wasn't the first. In Memphis in 1866, in Colfax in 1873, in Wilmington in 1898, and about 20 other cases, white communities of organized violence use that organized violence to overthrow and assassinate black leaders in communities, time and again. And zero of the perpetrators are punished. Zero of the perpetrators are punished. Why is political violence used? Because political violence works. That's where the Paul Pelosi story comes in. Political violence is a tool of those who have power in local communities who don't want to give up that power and want to intimidate those who might have the legal right to challenge their power. And we identify this very well in other societies, but we often don't see it in our own. The United States is actually one of the most violent societies in the world in the late 19th century. Why do we know this? Because foreign observers, including Otto von Bismarck, say this when they read about what's happening. They don't mean just the traditional battlefields. They mean what happens off the battlefields as well. You could argue that doesn't remain the case through all of the 20th century, certainly not after World War II, but it doesn't go away. When we think about our world today, the legitimacy people claim in using bullying and violence in a way that would not be accepted in other democracies. Can you imagine Germans doing the same thing? Can you imagine how people would respond to that? It is accepted. It is seen as valorized behavior. It is even seen as appropriate male behavior because of this history and because it has not been historically renounced in our society. And in fact, because it has worked. It has worked. What did the man, the guy who broke into the Pelosi home say? He said he wanted to break her kneecaps and bring her into Congress so other members of Congress would see that there was a consequence to their actions. That's classic political bullying. And unfortunately, there's nothing more American pie than that. It's built into our politics from this period, more so after the Civil War than before. You didn't need to do this before the Civil War. You needed to do this in your community thereafter. Noncompliance with the law is rampant in American society. We claim we are a society of rule of law, and I think we often are, but we often are not. We often are not. I have no particular reason to dislike the police today at all. In fact, one of my closest relatives, a close cousin of mine, just retired from the New York City Police Department, 25 years. Thank God he survived. Now he gets to really make money working as a private security person. He is as patriotic and as rule-following as anyone I know. He's more of a rule follower than I am. I don't have a problem with the police, but what we have to recognize is that the local police throughout this period are part of the problem, not the solution. And that history matters today. Why do people have the views of the police they have, whether appropriately founded or not? Why the distrust of authority that they have? There's a historical foundation for that that has not been sufficiently addressed. If you come from one of these communities, you don't have to be African American, you can be Jewish in Atlanta. If you come from one of these communities, the story of Leo Frank and others, you see the police as the problem, not as the solution. Now, it should be said that this is not all a story of horror, not at all. There's also the extraordinary courage of many individuals during this period who I try to profile, who deserve more attention. First and foremost, African Americans, former slaves. It is extraordinary how 4 million, I still have trouble finding the right words to describe it after all these years, 4 million slaves become citizens nominally within a matter of months. And more than 100,000 of them serve in the Union Army. More than 100,000 serve in the Union Army. I have some photos of them in the book. And these individuals go from being illiterate, non-wage earners to being literate wage earners, business people, and local leaders in an extraordinarily rapid time. Ulysses Grant is the best observer of this. More than anyone I've ever studied, Ulysses Grant has a fundamental transformation in the way he sees African Americans and others. He goes into the Civil War, believing what someone would believe from Illinois and Ohio, the inferiority of African Americans and the inferiority of Jews. And many of you know that early on in the war, he actually undertakes some very anti-Semitic actions that Jews always point to when they think about Ulysses Grant. By the end of the war, Grant has had a transformation in his views because of what he sees of the courage, capabilities, and patriotism of former slaves. And this is throughout his letters. I encourage you to read his letters. If you want to see a man have a come-to-Jesus moment, it is Ulysses Grant on this. What does he see? He sees African-American soldiers similar to what people saw during World War II with African-American and Jewish soldiers. He sees their commitment to their country. He sees their capabilities. And he sees how all the myths about them were wrong. And he is part of a group of Republicans who do all they can. And there is heroic effort by Northern as well as some Southern Republicans to help with forming schools, to create aid societies, to provide protection, to even join local paramilitary units. There are local paramilitary units created to protect African American communities that often have whites in them. So there was a long tradition of that in the United States. They often, by the way, tend to be the children of immigrants themselves who join these groups defending other disprivileged groups in the United States. These are Liberty Leagues. These are all kinds of schools that form. And the extraordinary thing is that the African Americans also remain in the Union Army, and they are the force in the Union Army that's actually enforcing the law in the South. So the election of 1868 is the fairest election with the highest African American turnout in American history until the 1950s. And it's because of the presence of the Union Army, and it's the presence of African Americans. The white soldiers go home. It's the African Americans who stay in the army and enforce the law, which is precisely what antagonizes the resistance. John Wilkes Booth himself is motivated most directly by seeing African American soldiers in Washington, D.C., holding white prisoners of war. And that story will be repeated. Ben Tillman, time and again, will condemn the African soldiers, he calls them, who are occupying our territory. The Union Army is filled with these former slaves. These former slaves are doing the yeoman's work for our democracy, but yet they are being blamed by those who fear the loss of power during this time. What we see then is a country in which a democracy is growing and shrinking at the same time. A democracy that's filled with new entrants, with new possibilities. And you can tell a story from 1865 through the end of the 20th century with the great migration of so many immigrants from various parts of the world, especially from Northern Europe, coming to the United States and making this country more diverse in extraordinary ways, contributing to the growth of what becomes the largest economy in the world. There's that story. And then there's also the story of the continued violence. Both are happening at the same time. Both are the story of then, and they're the story of today. In fact, they play off of one another. The rise of new citizens, former slave and immigrants, triggers the resistance of those who don't want to give up power. It's what Richard Hofstadter famously called status anxiety, the fear of losing your position. Now, this takes us to the pathology of leadership. And I've come to the conclusion, I know Will agrees with me on this too, that leadership is one of the most important subjects to study, but it's actually the most difficult. It's the most complex because there is no leader for all seasons. There's no person who you could take from another moment and bring them into ours and say they'd be the perfect leader because they did such a good job then. Abraham Lincoln would never survive in our media world today. You could not look like Abraham Lincoln and get by, even with the quality of his writing. And he wasn't a great speaker, by the way, he was a great writer. There's no such thing as a leader for all seasons, right? Herbert Hoover succeeds at everything in life, everything, until he's president. And Winston Churchill fails at almost everything until one moment. So there's hope for us, Will. There's hope. One day. What we see in this period, and it's something we have to take very seriously, I had not taken it seriously enough, is how our system might actually be built to choose the wrong leaders. Time and again after the Civil War, from that period, from Lincoln's assassination until the early 20th century, until Theodore Roosevelt, most of you can't even name the presidents in between, we have the closest elections in our history, closer than we had in the last election, highest turnout among eligible voters. By the 1890s, it's 85% of eligible voters. Now, not everyone's ineligible. 85% are voting. Some are voting multiple times, too. I shouldn't joke about that. We get high turnout, close elections, but we get singularly inappropriate people in the office of the presidency. People who are good campaigners and are elected for a good reason. There's a logic. There's a very clear logic. The system works. But it's sort of what Dick Betts wrote years ago about Vietnam. The system works to produce actually the suboptimal outcome. Let me give you the three most striking examples. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is chosen as Lincoln's vice president in 1864 for very good political reasons. As good a writer as Lincoln is, he's an even better politician. The true strength of Lincoln is his political skills. And he understands in 1864 that there's a good chance he's going to lose this election. And he's got to have someone on the ticket that is not just a Republican. He's got to show somehow that he's trying to get beyond the war because of the resistance among Copperheads and others in the North. So he puts Andrew Johnson on. He's the only, Andrew Johnson is, the only Southern Democrat in the Senate who does not secede. He is, like Andrew Jackson, his hero from Tennessee, pro-slavery and pro-union, and he puts union above slavery, to his credit. Lincoln puts him on the ticket. There's no thought that Johnson will ever do anything. There had never been a presidential assassination, and Lincoln was a healthy man. There was no sense that Johnson would ever take over. Johnson actually shows up drunk. I can document this. I thought it was a rumor. He actually shows up drunk for his inauguration. That's how little he cared about what he was going to have to do. When Lincoln is assassinated on Good Friday, 1865, Andrew Johnson takes over as president with all the war powers that Lincoln has accrued, many of which are unconstitutional or constitutionally questionable. He takes over as president, and here's the interesting thing. Congress does not meet in session again until December. So from April of 1865 to December of 1865, Andrew Johnson is virtual dictator. Begins to issue pardons, begins to readmit the states, and he has a very good argument. He says, well, Lincoln claimed the states never really seceded, that they were just in rebellion, so I'm going to accept that and say I don't need Congress's approval to readmit them. If they never left, I can reseat them without Congress's approval. So Johnson is not dumb. He makes the argument that the war powers Lincoln has used, which go beyond those of any president, beyond what George Washington ever could have imagined, right? Lincoln is conscripting soldiers in 1863 and thereon. There was no conscription in the Constitution. The founders never imagined that a president would have the right to conscript soldiers. They saw that as one of the biggest impediments to personal freedom. Lincoln takes on that power, as well as many others, for the purposes of the war. And now this other man has inherited it. Johnson's perspective as president is that we must, quote, forgive and move on. And that's what he seeks to do. All those traitors who left and came back and became powerful, they were all pardoned by him. They were all pardoned by him. We should also ask ourselves, this is something for Adam Klein, a lawyer, to comment on, why we even have pardoning power for a president. Should we have pardoning power? When has it ever been used for good? Certainly not in this case. Certainly not in this case. Ulysses Grant is then elected president finally after failed impeachment, which I talk about in the book. Ulysses Grant is elected. He's the first president to win large numbers north and south. Lincoln got almost no votes in the South. Grant will get both because he'll get African-American votes in the South and more votes in 1868 than again for 100 years. And he'll get the votes in the North. As a war hero, everyone believes this is a great hero, a man who has had a transformation. But Grant is singularly unprepared to be president. Let me put this very clearly. To be a war hero and a great military leader does not make you a good politician or non-military executive. Dwight Eisenhower might be the exception to that. He might be the exception to that. Grant can't get over the fact that members of Congress won't listen to him. He laments to his wife time and again, they just won't listen to me. They don't respect me. And you wonder, reading this now, why he's in this office then. Grant also doesn't like budgeting. He wants to use the presidency to lead in a hierarchical way, very focused upon what he sees as key elements of the enforcement of the law. And he creates the Justice Department that we know of today, created by Ulysses Grant to enforce the law in the South. He pushes through the Ku Klux Klan Act, uses the U.S. Army, the Union Army filled with African Americans, to crush the Ku Klux Klan. So he has a leadership goal. He has a military goal. He has a strategy. But the politics are not the place he's comfortable, nor where he has any talent. And in fact, he surrounds himself with people, just as Machiavelli predicts, who will do the politics for him, which means they will corrupt him. Machiavelli famously says, the prince cannot rely upon smarter people to help him lead. The prince must know how to lead himself and then bring those around him. Grant falls into all kinds of problems. Corruption, not personal, of those around him. Political favor-giving. And the absence of political unity. His own party, by 1872, will defund most of his programs. So in the wake of a recession that becomes a depression in 1873, Grant will find it impossible to hold his own party together, which controls both branches of Congress and controls the Supreme Court. By the way, I should make a side comment on that. The Supreme Court was changed in its number of judges and its jurisdiction 3 times in 10 years. And I've read every source I could find on this. No one claimed that was unconstitutional. People argued it was not good. No one claimed Congress did not have that power. No one. So there were 9 Supreme Court justices when Lincoln was elected, 8 of them from the South. 4 of them retire. Congress gives Lincoln the ability to appoint 4 and a 5th, so that they're now 10 on the court. They're 10 on the court. Johnson becomes president. Congress says, sorry, Andrew Johnson, you don't get to appoint anymore. The court goes down to 8, even down to 7. Then Grant is president. They give him 2 more appointments. They change the jurisdictions of the court. And so during Grant's presidency, you have 8 of 9 justices who are Republicans. It had been just 10 years earlier, 8 of 9 who are Democrats. That's not because of natural selection. That's because of the acts of Congress, and their jurisdiction has changed. So Grant has the courts, he has Congress, but he can't hold his own party together. Senator John Sherman, brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, Senator Lyman Trumbull, these are lions of the Senate from Illinois and Ohio. They tell Johnson time and again, you are spending too much time on the South. That's not where the future of our party is. We need to give up on the South and invest in the West. That's where the money is. And Grant is unable to keep his own party focused on fulfilling the needs of the post-war or war settlement, however you want to see it. Grant is succeeded by Rutherford B. Hayes. All of you think about Rutherford B. Hayes as a model of leadership every day, right? Rutherford B. Hayes was a very good man, also a Union veteran, governor of Ohio. He's one of the least corruptible figures I've studied from that period. It is his wife who bans alcohol in the White House. Lemonade Lucy, because alcohol, she said, corrupted the minds of men at night. That's literally what she said. She had real insight. She was talking to my mom, obviously. Rutherford B. Hayes is elected in 1876 in an election that he loses the popular vote in, and to which, to this day, we don't know who won the electoral vote. 3 states, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. It's always Florida, right? South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. The electoral votes are so close there. The votes are so close, and it's a matter of spoiled ballots that you count or don't count, that actually, even though Tilden has 40,000 more total votes in the country, in those states, to this day, we don't know who won. It really is a close judgment call. To become president, after a long process that I describe in the book, Hayes has to agree to pull all Union forces out of the South and to just move on, to forget. But what he recounts in his diary, which is a lovely diary to read, it's available actually in hardcover here at the library. Well, I haven't returned my copy yet, but if I return it, it's available here in hardcover. Hayes can't get the country to move on. He thinks that, okay, we've got an agreement, we'll just move on. But the Southerners continue to stick to what they're doing, to hindering the application of the law in the South, and Northerners continue to push for more investment in the West. And he's a completely failed president. He gets almost nothing done. The Posse Comitatus Act that many of you have heard of is passed actually because Southerners threatened to veto or to filibuster the military budget unless he signs that. So he has to sign the Posse Comitatus Act, which is hastily written. It has all kinds of legal problems, right, that again Adam could tell us all about. It's hastily signed in order to get a budget for the military. It's similar to the debt crises we constantly go through now. Our democracy does not, throughout that 40-year period, it's not that it chooses bad people, but it doesn't choose people with the right leadership skills. It doesn't choose people who have the ability to manage the politics of the time, who have a clear purpose, who are good at manipulation and good at public persuasion, who are able to build tireless, slow change. It does not elect those kinds of leaders. And I wonder if there's a deeper issue there. The men who get elected in this period are good party men, and they're good campaigners in the way you campaign at that time. But those qualities don't make them good leaders. We need to ask ourselves if we're in a similar situation today. Are the qualities that make you a good campaigner to get elected at the state and federal level, do they make it actually impossible to get the right person in there? Are we actually choosing the people who should lead? Or are we choosing the people who know how to campaign? That's what's happening in that period. Final area I want to talk about democracy. I think, as with most things, Abraham Lincoln nails what it is we're talking about. The Gettysburg Address, and I just have to say this, I say this all the time to undergraduates. I mean, this man who had 2 years of education, mastered the English language as no politician has, as no scholar has. He wrote 2 of the 5 most important speeches in our history, and he had 2 years of education. What are we all doing? What's happened to us? He defines democracy better than anyone can, right? Government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's democracy, right? Government of the people, by the people, for the people. The problem after the Civil War is that because of the transformation in slavery and the transformation of the American population, and because you have a large population that's already in power, fearful of losing power, that our society becomes more counter-majoritarian, that it violates that very principle, and counter-majoritarianism actually becomes more part of the political norm than it was before. We are a more populist democracy in the true sense of government of the people, by the people, for the people, with Andrew Jackson, in some ways, at least in his aspirations, than we are in the 1880s and 1890s. Let me give you some examples of this, and they still matter today. So there's a debate about what the 15th Amendment should say at the time. 13th Amendment, there's not really a debate about what it should say. There's a debate about how to get it passed. 14th Amendment, there's a huge debate about, as you all know, I hope the 14th Amendment is actually the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that had been vetoed by Andrew Johnson. His veto's overturned, and then it's made into an amendment because they're trying to get him to enforce it, and he refuses. The 15th Amendment, 1870 ratification, there's a large debate about how to write that amendment. There's an argument to be made by the African Americans in Congress, and there's 6 at the time, and the first African American senator, that the amendment should be written like the First Amendment, which I think is the cornerstone of our democracy. First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law to abridge my free speech or freedom of religion, right? Imagine our democracy if we didn't have that, right? We don't have such an amendment for voting. The 15th Amendment instead is written under the leadership of Northern Republican senators to say that you cannot deny voting based on race, but it allows the continued denial of voting in all kinds of other ways. And as the historian Alex Kesar has appropriately written, the United States becomes the most creative nation in finding ways to prevent people from voting thereafter. That's not a mistake. That's intentional. John Sherman is direct about this. I love this guy. He's even more direct and frank than his brother William Tecumseh Sherman. John Sherman says, I want the African Americans to vote in the South, but not in Ohio. He's very explicit about that. The Republican Party in the North is the party of small, white business people and landholders in Wisconsin, Ohio, upstate New York. African Americans are not actually what their party's about. And as the numbers grow, they don't want them to vote. So they write the amendment to give themselves a way out, right? That's actually smart politics, but it creates a long legacy. To this day, the United States can say 3 things about our voting. We have done more than any other country to create voting rights in other societies that exceed our own. In Germany and Japan, we forced them to create in their constitutions, in the basic law, voting protections we don't have. They have more explicit voting protections. Second, that we create a long tradition of normalized voter repression. And it's done historically by both sides. I think it's being done a little more by one side today, but historically it's done by both sides. Look, I grew up in New York City. New York City has its Democratic primary in March on a Wednesday. That's not an accident. That's not an accident, right? We find all kinds of ways to make it hard for people to vote. The 19th Amendment says you can't deny the right to vote based on sex. 26 says you can't deny it to someone 18 or older based on age. But we have no protection for voting that's equivalent to speech. And Texas is not alone, where it's easier to buy a gun than it is to vote. And I know this, having just witnessed this with my son. He had to go through a pretty elaborate registration process to vote. He was able to do it, but he had to go through that process. He's 18 now. This scares me to death. He could go and just buy a gun if he wants. I'm not against gun ownership. I'm not an expert on gun stuff. I'm not commenting on that. I'm just saying it tells us something about the nature of our society. If it's government of the people, by the people, for the people, it would seem to me you'd like to prioritize their speech, their freedom of religion, and their right to vote. Let's talk a little bit about gerrymandering. Everyone knows the story of gerrymandering here. It's an old story. It goes back to English rotten boroughs in the 16th century. There's nothing new about gerrymandering except the techniques and the uses of it, almost without limitation, that begins after the Civil War. So there was a presumption that you would gerrymander up to a point. And part of it was you had a more homogeneous electorate. But after the Civil War, we begin to see the process that's now been added to new technologies of doing everything you can from the start to redefine the electorate so that only certain people are voting or only certain people represent certain others. And it is actually in this period where you can see people saying that the leaders, the elected officials, should choose the voters rather than the voters choosing them. That's where the phrase comes from. And it's actually coming from Democrats in the 1870s and 1880s. And I already talked about the white primary. many states find ways to shape representation so that those who are elected are only representing some but not all, to reshape the denominator to change those who are elected. The Electoral College is built into the system, but that federal act of that then becomes what is used at the state and local level repeatedly. There is more gerrymandering, there is more explicit gerrymandering, there is more advocacy of it after the Civil War, and it continues. And what we see today is the extension of that. It's extraordinary to people from other democracies who come to our own to see that, because there's such an obvious solution, right? Which is to have expert committees that actually would do this rather than the politicians choosing their own. And we could come up with all kinds of standards. Maybe we'd argue over what those standards are. I, for one, by the way, don't think it's actually the courts to do this. I think it actually should be set up in our political system that the districts are drawn to be representative of who's in them and as competitive as possible, as opposed to non-competitive. If you look at a map of southern districts in the 1880s for Democrats and you look today, you see exactly the same thing, just for different parties. Mostly non-competitive districts in parts of the country filled with mixed populations, but yet non-competitive districts in the ways the districts are drawn. Last point on this, violence. I want to come back to that. The paramilitary violence, the bullying of this period, it doesn't end. It gets channeled into different directions. As late as 1964, when 3 civil rights workers are in Mississippi and lynched, there is very little mechanism for the federal government to enforce basic law. The 3 men who killed the civil rights workers in Mississippi are not prosecuted. They're not prosecuted. Emmett Till's murderer is not prosecuted. That's a story of violence with political purpose that is used time and again. And federal enforcement remains limited because of opposition to enforcement, not because of states' rights, but because of protecting the political aims of those who are committing the violence. Lyndon Johnson takes us pretty far. Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy in sending the military in, and then Lyndon Johnson in using the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act to move us forward. But that still is only part of the story, and the recession on the enforcement of those acts has contributed to more violence today. We have seen an increase in the threats toward elected officials. My own wife, who's a city council person here in Austin, has had repeated death threats. Nothing, I don't think, too serious, but still the fact that she's getting death threats. And by the way, they all are gendered as well. It's always her by her first name and talked to about in a certain way, and words I won't repeat that you can just imagine that are not said to men, even when you hate men. This is still part of our discourse. It's still part of who we are. It hasn't gone away. It hasn't been sufficiently prosecuted. It is, to some extent, from the 60s to the 90s. And presidents like Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan and others will support the enforcement of these civil rights laws. But as we've receded, either because we don't think they're important anymore, or because we want to support the bullying, we have seen a rise in this kind of violence. My point here is that the violence within our society that is pervasive is not random, and it's not because of people's mental illnesses, although that is a problem. It is because of the politics associated with that violence, and it's old politics that hasn't gone away. And in fact, that's exactly how the FBI analyzes it right now. And that's an accurate understanding of it. In the end, I think our democracy, in some ways, is the greatest democracy in the world, but it also has some deep, deep cancers, deep illnesses within. And these are illnesses that are solvable. I want to come back to where I started. I'm a believer in our country. I'm not supposed to say this as a scholar, but I want to say it. I love our country. We are, as Lincoln says, the last best hope on earth. We have to be. We were for my family. But we're not going to remain there or get there by simply accepting things the way they are and not seeing what's in front of us. You know, I believe that if you love your country, just as if you love your family, you hold it to the highest standards. I love our dinner conversation as a family. It always begins with what are the great things you've done today, and then how could you be better? And by the way, my family has usually the longest list for me. But because we love each other, we hold ourselves to the highest standards. Because we love each other, we ask ourselves how we've fallen short and how we can do better. I do this with my students as well. When I teach my big lecture course, I have 300 undergraduates. I cannot spend an hour a week with every undergraduate. The undergraduates who are willing to work the hardest, who care the most, I will spend the most time with them, and what will I be? Most critical of what they write. I'll spend the most time helping them to get better, right? We need to adopt that ethic today. Let me be clear, and I end the book on this. Teaching feel-good history is unpatriotic. Teaching feel-good history is negligent parenting. Those are the parents I meet who think their kids are the best at everything and just let them watch TV. That is the road to disaster. Being a real parent, being a real patriot, is saying, I love my country and I want to see my country in its fullness. And I want to make it better, and I can only make it better if I see where we have fallen short. That is what my book is about. That's where I hope we can go. And I don't believe that's a Democratic or Republican position. I believe that's an American position, and a position that all of us, at least as educators and educated, should adopt.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.